30 years sleeping beside a man who wrote love letters to someone else. Believe me, what's unforgivable wasn't the betrayal. The unforgivable thing was that he used my handwriting. I can still remember the dusty smell of the desk when I opened that drawer. It had been 3 months since I buried Jack, and like an idiot, I could still smell his cologne in the air, that cheap perfume he'd used since the 80s and that I always hated. But now couldn't bring myself to throw away. I wanted to tidy up, close chapters, all those things TV psychologists tell you to do. I didn't know what I was about to tidy up was a 3-decade lie. The drawer stuck at first, as if it too resisted being opened, but I pulled hard, and there it was. A box wrapped with blue ribbon, carefully folded, as if someone had hidden it, knowing it would be discovered someday. No name, no label, just that silence of objects that know too much. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a stack of letters tied with fine thread, yellowed paper, blue ink. The first began like this: "My love, each day I dream of you more alive than ever." It wasn't for me. No doubt about it. I had never received a letter from Jack. He said writing was a waste of time. But that handwriting? It was mine, or an exact copy. I froze, the page between my fingers, while I felt the floor give a slight tremor under my feet. How could it be my handwriting? I read another. "I can't stand the nights without you, but I can't leave her yet. I can't leave her yet." Leave whom? Me? That's when I laughed. Not a happy fit of laughter, no. A dry cackle, the kind that comes out when you no longer know if you're crying or mocking. I thought, what a genius, the bastard. He cheated on me with another using my own words. And of course I poured myself a glass of wine, because you don't face that kind of discovery with water. I read the dates: 1998, 2003, 2006. They matched. The years he traveled for work, the engineering conferences, the courses in other cities. Me, at home, watching the kids, ironing shirts, and believing love was this: endure, trust, be patient. Well, no. Turns out my patience was his alibi. As I went on reading, I felt a strange mix of outrage and fascination. Because, truth be told, the letters were beautiful, poetic, intense, even sweet. Jack, the man who greeted me with a grunt and a newspaper in my face, wrote like a damn poet when he wrote to her. Or to me. Or to whoever he was pretending I was. "Your laugh follows me down the hotel hallways. I hope she doesn't suspect." That line froze me. I hope she doesn't suspect. So I was she. Perfect. The official wife turned into the supporting character in his romance. I remember sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, my heart tied in a silly knot. I didn't cry. I've never been one to cry over men, not even my own. What I felt was curiosity, immense, absurd curiosity. Who was she? Since when? Why my handwriting? And, above all, why now? Maybe it was the alcohol or the shock of reality, but I caught myself thinking that, deep down, it was almost a compliment. I'd been so important in his head, he needed to write as me in order to deceive me. A kind of middle-aged romantic psychosis, a crime done with ink and paper. I opened more letters. Each had a different voice, sometimes tender, sometimes guilty. One said, "I can't imagine my old age without you." Another, "When she sleeps, I write to you." Another still, "Don't worry, everything is under control." Control. What a stupid word. Nothing is ever under control. It wasn't when he married me, nor when I buried his mother, nor when he got sick and swore the only thing he wanted was peace. And now I see it. What he wanted was silence. For no one to discover his little theater. I didn't sleep that night. I got up 3 times to reread them. I piled them up, ordered them by year, by ink, by type of paper, as if I were a sentimental detective. I told myself I should tell someone, but who? My kids? What for? So they'd hate their dead father? No, thanks. Let them keep the manual version. Good dad, strong mom, happy marriage. This truth was mine alone, and here I am, telling you. Before I go on with my story, I'm really curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is there today. I'd love to read you in the comments. I want to picture you there, listening while I do justice with my own words. Because, after all, this story isn't only mine anymore. It belongs to anyone who ever trusted someone blindly. To anyone who's felt their whole life was a version written by someone else. I turned off the living room light and stared at the blue box on the table. And I swear I felt something burn not outside, but inside, right in the center of my chest. The guy stole 30 years from me, and, on top of it, he mimicked my handwriting. But if he wanted to write a novel, now he'll have one. Chapter by chapter. And this time, I'm the protagonist. I spent the next 2 days unable to think about anything else. I didn't eat well, didn't sleep, didn't talk to anyone. I walked around the house with a cup of cold coffee in my hand and the letters stacked on the dining table like an unexploded bomb. Every time I tried to put them away, I felt short of breath, so I left them there, open, scattered, so the house's silence could get used to their presence. Funny, isn't it? You spend years sharing a roof with someone, and suddenly a handful of papers reveals you never knew him. The worst part was I couldn't even ask him anything, because he was dead. He'd had the elegance to die before being held to account. On the third night, I opened a bottle of wine, the good one, the one I saved for guests, and sat down in front of the box. I began reading them in order, one by one, with a notebook beside me, like one of those investigators in documentaries. I jotted down dates, places, hotel names, words that repeated. At first I did it to understand, but then I did it out of pure fascination. Jack, the most laconic man in the world, turned out to be a prolific author. He'd written more than 50 letters in 20 years, all with that syrupy tone he never once aimed at me. It was like discovering your husband had a secret life inside a book of cheap poetry. What caught my attention was that many letters ended the same way. Yours always, Jay. He never signed his full name, as if he hid from himself too. But the most disturbing thing was noticing some lines were mine, lifted word for word from old birthdays or domestic arguments. Happy people don't ask permission. I used to say that when we argued because he didn't want me traveling alone. And there it was, in a letter to his lover, as if he'd stolen my words to gift them to someone else. That night, I decided I wouldn't go on being a supporting character in my own marriage. If he had created a parallel story, I was going to write mine. And to write it, I needed to know who she was. A name wasn't enough. I wanted a face, a voice, a place I could point to and say, you. So I started with the basics. I checked old papers, receipts, envelopes with letterheads, anything that could give me a clue. I found a receipt for flowers, 17 years old, with a short message, for Julie, with eternal love, J. No address, but it did have the florist's name. I looked up the phone online and called, pretending I needed to send an anniversary bouquet. The girl, very kind, explained that the shop had closed years ago, but the owner still lived in the old quarter, just across the river. I took note. I don't know when I crossed from curiosity to spying, but the next day I was already in front of that woman's house, an elderly lady with a bun and an apron full of dried flowers. I asked about a certain Jack without giving too many details, and, after a couple of vague phrases, she smiled with that mischief people have when they've seen too many stories. Yes, of course I remember him. He came a lot, always asked for white roses for Julie, a brunette, very pretty. I think she worked near the center. My voice didn't shake when I thanked her and left, but as soon as I turned the corner, I felt something coming apart inside. It wasn't anger yet, more like a bitter incredulity. I never received white roses, ever. Not even for our 20th anniversary. He used to say flowers were a useless expense because they wilted right away. What irony. That night, I dreamed of him, sitting at the table, writing one of those letters with a smile I never saw on his face. I woke with my heart tight and dawn in my eyes. I went straight to the computer, something I never do so early, and searched him on Google, as if the internet would suddenly tell me what life had hidden. I typed Julie, along with the name of the company where Jack worked. Hundreds of results came up, but one stopped me. Julie Rogers, 46, interior designer. The photo was recent, from an exhibition. Short hair, light skin, a calm smile, the kind only people who think they've left the past behind have. There she was. Her. The woman who received my words and my years. The one who knew my husband in an upgraded version, kinder, more interesting. The one who read my phrases believing they were his. I stared at her for a long while, without moving the mouse, without blinking, with a mixture of astonishment and something like pity. Not for me, but for her, because she didn't know her story was also a lie written in my ink. I thought about writing her a message, something direct, cutting, but I held back. I didn't want to look like a crazy widow haunting other people's memories. Not yet. I wanted to observe her first, understand what kind of woman had been capable of awakening that in Jack or maybe in me, because I no longer knew who was speaking in those letters. I dressed carefully, put on perfume, looked in the mirror and said out loud, "Today, I'm going to see her." Not as a threat, but as an intimate promise. The cafe was crowded when I walked in. A modern place, soft music, baristas more concerned with latte art than with serving fast. I recognized her right away behind the counter, in a beige apron and a bracelet of blue beads. She talked to a customer, smiled, gestured with her hand. She had that ease of someone who doesn't suspect the past is watching her from 2 meters away. I approached, ordered a cortado, and waited. When she finally came to take care of me, she looked up and smiled. "Sugar?" "No thanks," I replied. "I'm sweet enough already." The line came out on its own, and as I said it I knew I had written it once, years ago, in one of those letters I found. It was mine, and yet she didn't know. I felt a strange tingle, half vertigo, half revenge. She charged me with a polite smile and went back to other customers. I stayed there, watching the way she moved, her voice, her routine. She wasn't a goddess nor an enemy, just an ordinary woman, maybe naive, maybe an unwitting accomplice. And I thought that, in a way, Jack had chosen well. We were two different versions of the same loneliness. That afternoon I went home, not knowing what I'd do next, but certain I couldn't stop. Something in me had already started moving, a current dragging me forward. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like adrenaline. And as I climbed the stairs, clutching my bag to my chest, I laughed silently. Because now, yes now, the story was truly beginning. I went back to the cafe the next day, and the next, and the next. At first I pretended I was just passing by, that I liked the smell of the place, or needed a little distraction. But the truth is, I wanted to watch her, understand her, take her apart piece by piece without her noticing. I always sat at the same table in the back with a view of the counter and pretended to read the paper, though I didn't turn a single page. Julie moved with a naturalness that irritated me, as if her life were a movie with no jolts, no past, no guilt. She greeted customers, laughed with coworkers, and now and then tucked a lock of hair behind her ear with a gesture I found unbearably familiar. Jack used to say he liked confident women, and look at her, there she was, radiant, unaware, alive, serving coffees while I exhumed ghosts. It took her a week to recognize me. On a Thursday afternoon, when the place was almost empty, she came over and said in that pleasant voice I was starting to resent, "You come here a lot, don't you? I'm glad to see you so often." I nodded, feigning surprise, as if I hadn't engineered this encounter from day one. I told her I lived nearby, that I liked the atmosphere, that getting out of the house did me good. She smiled with genuine interest and asked if I was alone. I said yes, that I'd been widowed recently. I saw her expression change for just a second, a flicker of discomfort, a tremor of empathy, something that flashed and was gone, but I caught it. After all, she knew the man we weren't naming had died not long ago. The conversation was short, almost trivial, but I felt a strange relief. I'd introduced myself. I'd stood in front of her. It was like stepping onto a stage that had waited years for the curtain to rise. And when I said goodbye, she thanked me with an "I hope to see you again soon." that sounded more sincere than I expected. I went home feeling a kind of power I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't joy, not revenge yet, but a kind of control over something that had been foreign to me for years. That night I opened the box of letters again and looked at them with new eyes. Now that I knew her face, I could picture her reading every word, believing they were for her, that Jack had written them with true love. I wondered if she'd ever felt guilt, if it ever crossed her mind that while she felt loved, another woman was making dinner alone at home, waiting for a call that never came. I don't know why, but I started to feel more curiosity than resentment. I wanted to know how it had been, how long it lasted, how it ended. And above all, whether she had also been living deceived, just like me. In the following days, our relationship became a routine without planning it. She greeted me every time I walked in, asked about my day, sometimes sat for a couple of minutes to chat while the rush subsided. I told her small things, that I had 2 adult children, that I liked walking in the park, that I hated green tea. I never mentioned Jack, nor did she. It was as if we both sensed that behind those pleasant chats there was a forbidden ground, a minefield neither of us wanted to step on yet. One afternoon, when the sun came through the window and turned everything that late summer gold, she told me she'd worked many years in a construction company, that she left because the environment was very male and heavy. She said it with a forced smile, and I knew she was speaking of him without naming him. I felt a stab in my stomach, a mix of jealousy and sadness. But I pretended not to understand, and carried on as if nothing. With each of her words, the puzzle clicked a little more into place. She spoke of her past with a melancholy tone, like someone recalling something that marked her but no longer hurts. "I was very young then," she said once. "I got into things I shouldn't have, but well, I suppose we all do at some point." That line echoed in my head all day. Into things I shouldn't have. I wanted to ask what kind of things, but I held back. If I learned anything in life, it's that silence sometimes reveals more than questions. When I got home, I poured a whiskey and put on an old record, one Jack hated, because he said female singers shouted too much. I played it at full volume just for the pleasure of imagining his face if he could hear me. And meanwhile, I thought of Julie. Not as the other, but as a missing piece of the story. Something didn't add up. A detail was slipping through, a shadow between the dates and phrases of those letters. He had been careful, yes, but careless too in his arrogance. No one's that methodical when they think they'll never be found out. The next day I went back to the cafe, and she treated me to a little pastry. Said it reminded her of her grandmother. I accepted, more out of curiosity than hunger, and between bites she let slip, almost without realizing, that she'd lived an impossible love with a married man many years ago. She said it looking away, as if the air weighed heavy. And before I could react, she added, "Don't judge me. It was a long time ago. He's dead now, and deep down I think his wife knew." I felt my shoulders tense, but I kept my cool. I smiled with that serenity you learn over the years and answered, "And if she knew, maybe she chose silence." She nodded slowly, not fully grasping what I'd just said. There was a short silence between us, the kind that doesn't make you uncomfortable but leaves an echo. Then I knew I'd reached the story's center. It wasn't a suspicion. It was a certainty breathing in front of me. I left the cafe with my head full of noise and my heart pounding. I walked down streets I didn't recognize, not knowing where I was going. I just needed space to think. I had wanted to understand, and now I understood too much. The problem is, truth doesn't bring relief. It brings movement, and I couldn't stop it. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. My eyes were tired, but they shone. I thought of Jack, of Julie, of the letters, and felt a kind of inner laugh, bitter and alive. I had slipped into their story quietly, but now I was the one directing it. I didn't know how or when, but at some point I decided it wasn't enough to discover. Something inside me wanted more. Not revenge yet, not exactly justice, maybe just truth. And truth, like anything that burns, needs air. The following weeks became a silent game no one else seemed to notice. Julie and I saw each other almost daily, sometimes in the cafe, sometimes in the square across the street where she went to smoke in secret because she said she didn't want to set a bad example for the young staff. I listened, smiled, feigned innocence, and meanwhile rebuilt my own mental map of that relationship that had changed my life without me knowing. It wasn't curiosity driving me anymore. It was something closer to a desire for balance, to put each piece in its place, as if by understanding everything I could finally close the drawer and sleep in peace. But each conversation opened a new door, and before I knew it, I was walking through the maze with my eyes open and my heart on guard. Julie began to trust me, maybe because my age gave me a sort of moral authority, or because my silence invited her to speak. She told me details she hadn't shared with anyone. The places where she met him, the promises he made, the impossible plans they wove when the world seemed on their side. Sometimes she spoke of Jack without saying his name, and I let her, because there was something revealing in her tone. She wasn't the cynical, frivolous woman I'd wanted to imagine. She was someone who had loved, who had believed, who had suffered too. That unsettled me, because it took away the absolute victim role that's so comfortable at first. Discovering her humanity threw me off. One afternoon, as we walked to the bus stop, she told me she sometimes dreamed of him, that she woke up feeling she could still smell his cologne, the same one that for years permeated my house. She said she'd written him many letters she never sent and kept them in a box, in case someday someone wanted to know the truth. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The irony was so absurd, I had to stifle a chuckle. If only she knew the real letters were in my living room, sorted by year and smelling of old paper. I asked, in the calmest voice I could fake, whether she'd ever thought of looking for the wife of that man. She dropped her gaze and said no, that stirring up the past would be cruel, that the poor woman had probably lived peacefully, knowing nothing. I nodded, because if I spoke, I'd lose control. And something I learned late is that calm is scarier than shouting. After all, she didn't know who she was walking with. I didn't switch on the lights when I got home that night. I sat in front of the window with a glass in my hand, watching the neighborhood lights. I thought about her voice, her innocence, the way she pronounced his name as if he still belonged to her. I thought about myself too, about the woman I'd been for so many years, believing fidelity was a refuge and not a cage. I realized something had changed. I no longer wanted to understand Jack, not even Julie. I wanted to understand myself. When did I become the woman who accepts everything without asking? The next morning while making the bed, I laughed to myself. A short, dry laugh, the kind that comes when you discover the size of your own stupidity. I told myself the story needed an ending, and if he hadn't had the courage to face his truth, someone would have to. And that someone would be me, not because I wanted revenge, but because I deserved answers. Not his, he was dead, but hers, the one still breathing, the one who could still answer. I started planning without realizing it. Every visit to the cafe was a new scene I composed with precision. I learned her schedule, her routines, her gestures. I knew when she was tired, when nervous, when happy. Sometimes I watched her laugh with customers and wondered if Jack made her laugh like that, or if he just deceived her the same way he deceived me, dressing promises up as cheap flattery. Deep down, I began to feel something like compassion, but a poisoned compassion, because beneath it pulsed the idea that she'd had something of mine, and though she didn't know she'd stolen it, she enjoyed it. One afternoon, unplanned, she invited me to sit with her on the terrace. The sun was setting, the air smelled of roasted coffee and dry leaves, and for a moment I almost forgot everything. She told me she'd been single for years, that after that story she never fully trusted anyone again. She said it had been a beautiful, sad love that marked her forever. I listened without blinking, my heart tight, not knowing whether to admire or pity her. Then she dropped a line that chilled me. Sometimes I think his wife knew and let him be happy for a while, like she pitied him. I had to clench my fists under the table not to show anything. That line drilled in my ears. I saw myself 30 years ago, making dinner while he said he had a meeting, believing love was understanding. Pity. What a cruel word. I said nothing. I just smiled and replied, maybe she did know. Maybe she chose silence. She looked at me, confused, as if she didn't completely understand, and quickly changed the subject. That night, on my way home, I felt calm slipping through my fingers. Knowing, listening, wasn't enough anymore. I had a need burning inside me, to pull her out of the role of innocent spectator and put her in front of the truth. I didn't know how to do it without seeming crazy, but I sensed that if I kept quiet, that elegant anger I kept at bay would morph into something much worse. I arrived, opened the drawer where I kept the letters, and looked at them once more. The thread tying them was frayed, as if they too wanted to come loose. I thought those letters were a testament not of love, but of arrogance. Jack had written his version of the story, and I had accepted it without reading. Now it was my turn to write mine with clean hands and a steady pulse. Before bed, I lit a candle and left it next to the box. Not a religious gesture, more a silent declaration of war. While the flame danced, I promised myself this: the next time I saw Julie, I would no longer be the pleasant widow at the cafe. I would be the woman who knows the truth, who has all the pieces of the puzzle and has decided to start moving them, not with fury, but with intelligence, not with screams, but with words. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept unafraid of dreams, because I knew that, when I woke, nothing would ever be the same. The next day, I woke with a different feeling, as if overnight I'd made a decision without realizing it. The air seemed lighter, or maybe I was breathing differently. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and looked at the city with a deceptive calm, the kind you only have when you know you're about to do something that can't be undone. There was no concrete plan, but a clear intention: stop being a spectator. I had listened enough, understood too much, swallowed more than one life should. It was time to move the story, even if only a centimeter, even if it hurt. That afternoon, I went to the cafe as usual, greeted Julie, chatted about trivialities, feigned normal. But while I watched her serving coffees, a fleeting idea crossed my mind, a spark that lit so fast I didn't have time to question it. If Jack had stolen my voice, if he used my words to deceive her, why not return the favor? Why not lend her, for a moment, the same distorted mirror he used on us? Not to hurt her, that's what I told myself, though maybe I was lying, but to return the truth in the same wrapping he'd used to hide it. That night, I searched for paper, ink, and an old envelope. I wrote the first letter with almost surgical neatness, imitating the handwriting he'd copied from me. It took me over an hour to fill a page, not because I doubted the words, but because I wanted the tone to be exact, each line to sound like something she might recognize. "Dear Julie," I began, and my pulse trembled a second before going on. "There are things we think are buried, yet they breathe under the ground. If you ever thought I lied to you, you were right. But not everything was a lie." I read it aloud several times, seeking that perfect point between tenderness and threat. I signed it with a simple J, just as he did. The next morning, I typed the cafe's address and slipped the letter into the mailbox, no return address. I didn't expect an immediate reaction, didn't even know if she'd read it, but just sending it gave me back something I thought I'd lost: control, the power to narrate, to steer events. I felt alive, awake, dangerous. 2 days passed with no sign. Julie seemed the same, smiling, polite, showing nothing different. But on the third day, when I walked in, I saw she'd changed. Her eyes were puffy, her expression tense, and when she saw me, she looked down. I knew at once she'd received it. I ordered my coffee with my usual composure and sat, pretending to read. I watched her move, stumble, check her phone now and then. Something in her perfect routine had cracked, and that small tremor tasted like justice. That night, eating dinner alone in front of the TV, I wrote the second one, this time more direct. "Julie, the dead don't always keep quiet. Some truths don't disappear even if nobody speaks them. Think carefully about what you believed you lived. Not everything was yours." When I signed it, I felt a tingle in my chest, as if something inside me clicked into place. It wasn't cruelty. It was a way to restore balance, to settle accounts with words, not with shouting. Over the next week, I watched her lose her composure little by little. Each day she was more distracted. Things slipped from her hands. She forgot orders. Once, a customer asked if she was okay, and she only nodded with an awkward smile. I watched from my table in silence, not fully enjoying it, because something in me began to churn as well. Seeing her fragility up close reminded me of my own, and that hurt more than I expected. One afternoon she sat down in front of me without warning. She took me by surprise. Her eyes were red, as if she had cried. "I don't know what's happening to me lately," she said. "I feel like everything I lived is coming back, as if it hadn't ended." I listened without interrupting, feigning surprise, while my heart pounded. "Sometimes I think I'm getting signs, letters, I don't know, as if he wanted to tell me something from wherever he is." I had to hold my breath not to smile. I simply tilted my head, gently, and replied, "Sometimes the dead need to be heard not to return, but to leave for good." She looked at me, confused, as if my words carried a weight she didn't understand, then changed the subject. I didn't sleep well that night. In my dreams, I saw myself writing and burning papers at the same time, as if each letter I sent both freed me and tied me a bit more. I began to wonder if I was really doing it for her, or if, deep down, I needed to hear myself. I'd been silent so long that now words poured out in a torrent, a revenge made of ink. I kept writing. The third letter was harsher, more confessional. "Not everything he told you was a lie, but you were never the only one. There was another life behind yours, another woman, another story. Maybe you already know her. Maybe you see her more often than you imagine." I folded it carefully and dropped it in the same mailbox, at the same hour. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. The days that followed were a silent spectacle. Julie walked differently, spoke little, her smile an empty gesture. One afternoon, I realized she was watching me from behind the counter, as if trying to decipher something in my face. I felt a shiver, not guilt or fear, but a lucid awareness of what was happening. I had stopped being invisible. Now, in a way I couldn't explain, we were bound by the same secret. I left the cafe without saying goodbye, walked the long street with the wind in my face, and understood there was no turning back. The letters weren't simple messages anymore. They were the voice of what I'd never said, the echo of my anger, the language of my newly learned freedom. I thought of Jack, and almost pictured his smile from beyond, convinced he still pulled the strings. But no, not this time. This time, the script was mine, the words were mine, and for the first time in 30 years, I was the one writing the story. The days slowed after the third letter. Not because nothing happened, but because everything felt weighted with an invisible mass, a tension you could touch in the air. Julie was no longer the cheerful woman of the cafe. Now she was quieter, more alert, with that gaze that settles on things like it's searching for something that keeps slipping away. Every time I walked in, I saw her look up and, though her smile was still there, it had lost its innocence. I knew then she was beginning to suspect. Not me yet, but life, the comfortable reality starting to crack. It was a tiny change, almost imperceptible, but I noticed it in how she breathed, how she held the tray, how her voice broke at the end of sentences. And I must admit it, I felt powerful. Not proud, not happy, but in control, as if suddenly I'd learned to handle fire without getting burned. One afternoon I walked in and found her sitting at a table, alone, with one of the letters in front of her. She didn't try to hide it or pretend she didn't have it. She just looked at me and nodded, as if we shared a secret neither of us dared to name. I ordered my coffee and sat a few meters away, pretending to read the paper, but I couldn't look away from her face. Something in her expression had changed, a blend of fear and clarity, like she'd understood something she couldn't accept. When I stood to leave, she called me. "Margaret?" She said my name, for the first time, and that startled me. I didn't remember telling her. "Can we talk for a moment?" I nodded, knowing this moment would come sooner or later. We sat at the back table, where the hum of the espresso machine muffled our words. She looked at me with a new seriousness, none of her usual sweetness. "I've received some letters," she said. "I don't know who they're from, but they talk about him. I feigned surprise, of course, with that incredulous look you perfect after years of marriage, lies, and appearances. Who? I asked, as if I didn't know the answer perfectly. Julie lowered her voice and said, Jack. You knew him, didn't you? You worked together. My breath stopped for a second, but my mask stayed on. No, I didn't know him. I lied with a naturalness that scared me, though the name does sound familiar. She sighed and leaned her elbows on the table. It's just, I don't understand. So many years have passed, and suddenly someone writes with details no one could know. Places, phrases, things I lived more than 20 years ago. At first I thought it was a joke, but it isn't. It's like someone wants me to remember something or to feel guilty. As I listened, I felt a strange stab, a mix of pity and triumph. It was the first time I saw her version of pain, the exact mirror of mine. Inside, I told myself this was fair, that somehow we were balancing the scales. But seeing her so fragile, so confused, stirred something I didn't expect. Anger mixed with compassion, and for a moment I doubted whether to go on. I touched her hand, an impulsive gesture that surprised me as much as it did her. Maybe, I said, slowly, those letters aren't to punish you. Maybe they're to help you understand something you didn't then. Julie looked at me as if I'd spoken a truth she couldn't bear. And how would you know? She asked. Because sometimes ghosts just want to be looked at head on, I replied. Not to scare you, but so they'll stop chasing you. We stayed in silence. She nodded with a quiet sadness, gathered up the letter, and said she needed some air. I watched her step outside and stand still, staring at the sky like someone seeking answers that aren't up there. In that moment, I understood the game had changed. It wasn't about scaring or confusing her anymore. It was about putting her in front of the whole story. That night, I went home with my head full of voices. The letters, Jack, her face, mine, all mixed together. I started to wonder how much he had played with us. Maybe there hadn't even been a real Julie or Margaret in his mind. Maybe he simply needed two mirrors to see himself bigger, more loved, more alive. And we had been just that. Reflections in which he recognized himself, not two women, but two versions of his own ego. I opened the blue box and spread the letters across the table. I read loose fragments, out of order. In one, he spoke of me as a burden. In another, of her as a promise. But read together, if you threaded the lines, you could see it was the same speech aimed at two different recipients with barely any changes. The same script with different names. You are my calm in one. You are my madness in another. The man who made me believe he didn't know how to express himself had a perverse talent for saying exactly what each of us needed to hear. And it was there, among papers and wine dregs, that I understood something that chilled me. Neither she nor I had really lived with Jack. We had lived with his version of us. He'd molded our images like a novelist writing characters. I was the reasonable wife. She, the passionate mistress. He was the author maintaining the tension between us. Without conflict, there was no story. Without story, there was no him. I stared at my reflection in the window and realized that, for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of the woman I saw. The one who'd kept quiet so long, who'd endured so much, was now the only one capable of understanding the whole trick. I smiled not with joy, but with clarity. If he had written his version of events, I would write mine, but not with ink, with gestures, with actions. I took a blank sheet and wrote a final letter, different from the others. I didn't imitate his handwriting or tone. It was mine. Julie, I wrote. Sometimes love looks too much like a well-told lie. You and I were chapters in a book he can't keep writing. But if you ever want to know the ending, come find me. The story wasn't his. It was ours. And it isn't over yet. I left it without an envelope, without a signature, and slipped it into my bag. The next day, when I walked into the cafe, I waited until she was distracted and left it on her table among the napkins. I didn't know what would happen next, nor whether I'd have the courage to face what came, but something inside me had already calmed. It wasn't revenge I sought. It was to belong, at last, to my own life. I slept better that night. I dreamed of Jack, not the real man, but a version looking at me from afar, small, blurry, voiceless. And when I woke, I knew something had broken for good, but in the best way, because I finally understood. For years I'd lived in his story, and now he was the one trapped in mine. When I walked into the cafe that morning, the air was thicker than usual. There was no music, or maybe there was, but so low it sounded like a rumor. Julie sat at her usual table with the letter open in front of her. I recognized it at once. My handwriting, my words, the page I'd left the day before among the napkins. I didn't look at me right away, as if still deciding whether it was a trap or a revelation. I walked slowly to the counter, ordered my coffee in the most neutral voice I could muster, and waited. When she looked up, our eyes met, and something in her expression told me she knew. Not everything, but enough. She approached slowly, with that cautious step people use when they don't know if they're about to receive a caress or a blow. She asked if she could sit with me. I nodded without a word. She sat across from me, no coffee, no bag, just the folded letter in her hand. She set it on the table, turned it slowly until it faced me, and said, "It was you, wasn't it?" There was no way to hide it. I didn't try to lie. I was tired of lies, even the necessary ones. I looked her in the eyes, took a breath, and said, "Yes." I didn't say it with guilt or arrogance, just with weariness. She didn't move, didn't even blink. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice low, coming from somewhere deeper than the chest. And I didn't know where to begin. There were so many reasons they canceled each other out. Anger, curiosity, the absurd need for justice, the desire to look truth in the face without adornment. I leaned forward and spoke slowly, picking each word like walking on thin ice. "Because he wrote to you using my voice. Because for years I read your letters without knowing you existed. Because I needed to understand which part of that story was mine and which was made up. Because if I didn't look for you, I would go on living in his shadow. And because I realized you were living in it too." Julie pressed her lips together, turned her head aside, and for a few seconds I thought she'd get up and leave. But she didn't. When she looked back, her eyes were full of tears, not the kind that fall right away, but the kind that weigh, kept in place by pride or dignity. "He told me you knew," she whispered, "that you'd accepted everything." I laughed, a hollow, bitter laugh that echoed among cups and empty chairs. He made that up too. Jack couldn't live without a lie at hand. The silence that followed was long and dense. No one came in, no one spoke. Outside, the day seemed frozen. Julie played with the edge of the paper, folding and unfolding it, as if she needed to do something with her hands not to fall apart. "I loved him," she said at last, and she said it with such naked sincerity, it disarmed me. "I loved him, truly. I never meant to hurt anyone." I nodded. "I know. But he did. And not just me or you, he hurt what we were when we loved him. He stole from us the chance to choose who we wanted to be." She nodded slowly, biting her lower lip. "I always knew something was off," she said, "things that didn't fit. Sometimes he used your phrases without knowing they were yours. I know that now. He said they made him feel at home, and I thought it was a metaphor. How stupid I was." "No," I said calmly. "You weren't stupid. You were in love. And the in love are blind, just like the faithful. I was too. Don't think yourself better or worse than me. We were two women holding up the same mirage." Her tears finally fell soundless. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but found nothing honest. No line can erase 20 years of lies. So I just let her cry. When she looked up again, her expression was different, as if crying had washed something from her face. "What do we do with all this?" she asked. "We tell it," I answered without hesitation. "Not for others, for us. So we don't stay in the version he wrote." She frowned, not fully understanding. "And how do you tell something like this?" "Head on," I said. "No frills, no hunting for victims or culprits. Just the truth. One line each. Like we're digging it up together." Julie nodded. She stayed quiet for a while, then said something that pierced me. Always thought he saw me in a way no one else could. Now I get that he didn't see me, he saw the shadow you cast. And there, for the first time, I felt real compassion. Not for her, for both of us. For the shared naivete, for loving a man who didn't know how to love without disguise. We stayed silent. The barista watched us from afar, curious, but didn't come over. Outside, the afternoon had begun to turn golden, and the sun's reflection slipped through the window, lighting the dust motes in the air. Julie folded the letter, put it in her bag, and looked at me with a new resolve. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need." She stood slowly, touched my hand, and before leaving, murmured, "Thank you for telling me like this. You could have destroyed me, and you didn't." I watched her go, walking along the sidewalk until she disappeared into the crowd, and felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. There was no victory in it. No justice or redemption. Only truth. And truth, when it arrives, doesn't heal it, cleans, it burns, it leaves the skin new and sensitive. I stayed a while longer, not touching the now cold coffee. I looked at my reflection in the window glass, and it seemed like another woman's face. One who had learned, the hard way, that silence doesn't protect, that patience isn't a virtue when it's used as a gag. That night I walked home slowly, wind in my face and a peculiar sense of closure, unfinished, but real. Jack was gone. Julie too, not in the same way. And I, finally, didn't need to write any more letters. The words had done their job, hauling truth out of its grave. When I got home, I poured a drink and lit a candle. Not for him, nor for her, for me. For the woman who could stare a lie in the face and stay standing. And as the flame danced in silence, I thought that, in the end, the story wasn't a tragedy. It was a liberation disguised as loss. And though my hands trembled, I had already crossed the line. The days that followed were thick with silence, a silence that didn't hurt but didn't soothe either, as if the world had stopped to see what we'd do with what remained. I didn't go back to the cafe for a whole week. Not out of fear, but because I needed space to hear myself without the noise of habit or Julie's gaze on me. I set about cleaning the house, not a superficial clean, but the kind you do when you're trying to shed a ghost. I opened drawers, tossed clothes, sorted papers, moved furniture. Every corner of that house had his shadow. The books he never read but displayed. The records he said were too sad. The coat that still smelled of his cologne. And the most absurd thing was that, in the middle of it all, I began to feel tenderness. Not toward Jack, but toward the woman I'd been beside him, the one who thought loving meant keeping everything in its place, even the lie. One night I found a beach photo of us from so long ago we were barely recognizable. He was smiling. I wasn't. I had that concentrated expression, as if I were posing for a role I didn't fully understand. I put the photo in the blue box, the same one holding the letters, and stared at them a while. I couldn't keep them. I knew it. They had served their purpose. They'd given me back my voice, shown me the scale of the sham, let me step out of the spectator's role. But they still sat there, intact, like a trap ready to spring again. I waited until midnight. I lit a candle, opened the windows, and sat in front of the box. I took out the letters one by one, stacked them neatly on the floor, and read them one last time. Some no longer hurt. Others made me laugh. There were lines so corny they seemed written by someone else. "Your absence is killing me," said one. "You're my refuge and my torment," said another. "How easy it is to promise eternity when you write with ink and not with deeds." When I finished the last, I took a lighter and brought it to the flame. The paper took a few seconds to yield, as if resisting disappearance, and then it caught all at once, clean, dry. The smoke rose slowly, spiraling with the smell of old ink and dust. I watched them burn, one after another, until only ashes and tiny glowing bits remained. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a strange peace, as if I had finally finished a conversation pending for decades. The phone rang soon after. A voice message from Julie. I hadn't expected it, but I wasn't surprised either. Her voice sounded tired, vulnerable, different. "I don't want to bother you," she said, "but I needed to tell you something. Thank you. Not for the letters, but for having the courage I never had. I don't know if I can go back to the cafe tomorrow. I guess I need to think about all that we were or thought we were. I just want you to know I understand you, and I hope one day we can talk without ghosts between us." Hearing her left me with a strange feeling, a blend of relief and emptiness. The recording ended, and I sat with the silence. I thought of replying, but didn't. Something in her tone sounded definitive, and I've learned not everything needs to be closed with words. Sometimes you just let the echo fade on its own. I blew out the candle and threw the windows wide. Fresh air came in and carried away the smell of smoke. I watched the ashes until the breeze began to scatter them, and in that instant I knew they no longer belonged to me. Not the letters, not the story, not even the anger. Everything had turned into something remote, like a dream you still remember but no longer hurts. The next day, I went out early for a walk. The city smelled of fresh bread and damp leaves. I passed couples holding hands, hurried mothers, people heading to work with no idea a world can collapse in silence while they wait for the light to change. I walked aimlessly until I reached the cemetery. It wasn't carrying flowers, just the last letter, the one I'd never read, the one he'd left before dying and I'd avoided for months. I took it from my bag and opened it. "Dear Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, it's because I'm gone. I know there were things I didn't tell you, not for lack of love, but out of fear. Fear of losing the image we built. Fear of you seeing me as I really am." I stopped there. I didn't need more. I already saw him, I had seen it all. What moved me most wasn't his regret, but that final confession of cowardice. At least in that he was honest. I set the letter on his grave, no anger, no tears, and whispered something even I didn't fully hear. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else, a more honest goodbye. Then I stood still a while, watching the wind move the dry leaves, and felt a new lightness, a freedom not born of forgetfulness, but of sheer exhaustion. I had fought so hard to understand everything, and in the end, there was nothing left to understand. That night, back at home, I opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass, and sat by the window. It was raining outside, and the streetlights reflected on the ground as if everything were on pause. I thought of Julie, what she might be doing, whether she was still keeping her own letters or had burned them too. I imagined maybe she had, that now both of us slept a little lighter. The fire had done its work. No evidence, no objects, no papers. Only the story etched in my memory with the cruel sharpness of true things. And for the first time in a long while, I understood you don't have to destroy what was to go on. Sometimes it's enough to let it burn just enough. Several days went by before I set foot in the cemetery again. I didn't plan it one morning. I just woke with the feeling I had to go, as if something there needed to be seen one last time. The sky was overcast, a thick gray, and the air smelled of wet earth. I walked among headstones slowly, reading names, years, the wilted flowers piling up on tombs. Jack's looked the same as last time, sober, clean, with a shiny plaque where someone, maybe my kids, had left a fresh bouquet. I stood there a moment, not sure what to do, until a bird's noise snapped me out of it. I'd brought no letters, no flowers, no prepared words, only the need to look at that slab of stone and understand the story ended there, under the ground, and everything else was just echo. I bent a little, touched the cold edge of the marble, and spoke without thinking much. "In the end, you pulled it off," I murmured. "You left me with all your versions and no answers. But you know what? I'm done looking for you in what you wrote. I'm no longer interested in who you were when you lied, nor who you pretended to be. What interests me now is me, the one who stayed alive, the one who had to learn to breathe after you." I said it, and it sounded firmer than I expected. There was no hate, just tiredness, a sort of weary serenity that settles in when you understand you don't need to win anything anymore. I sat on the bench in front of the grave and took a new notebook from my bag. I didn't intend to write a letter, but to start something different. I opened to a blank page, put pen to paper, and wrote my name. Only that, Margaret. I stared at it for a few seconds, surprised at how strange it felt to see my name on a clean page without the shadow of his voice around it. Then I kept writing, not about him, not about Julie, but about me. The woman who now walked alone, who had become the author of her own story. It was almost therapeutic, a way to reclaim my space in the world. Suddenly, I heard steps behind me. I turned and saw a figure approaching. It was Julie. She wore a long coat, hair tied back, eyes reddened by the wind. We looked at each other without surprise, as if both of us had known this meeting was inevitable. She said nothing, just set a small bouquet on the grave and stood beside me. For a minute, we shared the same silence, the same heavy air. Then, without looking at me, she said, "I didn't think I'd ever see him again." "Me neither," I answered. "But I guess we needed to close something." "Yes," she said, "something that never really began well." We stayed there, side by side, looking at the headstone that, in some way, had united and separated us at once. I didn't feel resentment, nor affection. What I felt was simpler: understanding. Two women looking at each other without masks, knowing truth no longer serves to fight, only to accept. Julie took a deep breath and added, "You know what's strangest? I still dream of him, but not like before. It's no longer him, it's more like a shadow that looks at me and walks away. I think he's leaving." "Then let him go," I said. "The dead don't leave if you hold on to them." Julie nodded and looked at me for the first time. "Thank you for telling me everything," she murmured. "I don't know if I could have gone on living with that doubt." "Me neither," I replied. "And even if it hurts, I prefer this version." We said goodbye without hugs, without promises. Each took a different path among the graves. I watched her go and knew we wouldn't meet again. We didn't need to. We had done what we had to do: face the truth and lay it down where it belonged. That afternoon, back home, my body felt lighter. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the rain begin. Drops tapped the glass with an almost musical cadence, and in that repetition there was something hypnotic, as if the world were washing the story for me. I closed my eyes and breathed. For the first time in a long while, I felt neither anger nor sadness, only a strange calm, a kind of reconciliation with not having all the answers. I thought of the years with Jack, of the silences, the laughs, everything we never said. I thought of Julie too, her tired face, the way she'd learned to look at me without guilt. We were like two survivors returning to a battlefield after the war, searching for remnants of who we'd been, knowing the wisest thing is to find nothing. That night I opened the notebook again and kept writing. Not about them, but about what would come after. The days, the little routines, unhurried walks, conversations with my children, rainy afternoons like this one. It was an attempt to build something different, something born not of lack, but of possibility. I surprised myself writing long lines, almost cheerful ones, and understood that sadness can also be fertile if you let it rest long enough. When I finished, I looked one last time at the empty box where the letters had been. I thought of everything it had held: love, lies, desire, guilt, and how in the end it all fit into a handful of ashes. I closed the lid and put it on the highest shelf, not to forget it, but so I wouldn't trip over it. It was no longer an altar or a wound. It was just a part of my story. That night, I dreamed of the sea. Not the beach from that old photo, but a new sea, immense, shoreless. I was there, alone, walking by the waterline, and each step erased the one before. No letters, no voices, no names. Only the sound of water and the certainty that, at last, I was free. That morning I woke before dawn, no alarm, no jolt, just with that clarity that comes when something inside you finally settles. The house was silent, and for the first time that silence didn't weigh on me. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sky shift from gray to a pale pink, dissolving slowly over the rooftops. It was one of those sunrises that promise nothing grand, but bring peace. And I understood, without thinking, that the story had ended not with a crash, nor a revelation, nor a dramatic forgiveness, but with something much simpler: acceptance. What had been no longer hurt, what hadn't been no longer mattered, and what remained, this unadorned present, belonged to me. I decided to go for a walk. The air was fresh, smelled of bread and wet asphalt. I crossed the square, greeted the street cleaner, watched children arrive with backpacks too big for their shoulders. Everything was the same as always, and yet everything was different. I realized I'd spent my whole life waiting for extraordinary moments, signs, gestures, when freedom is not a movie scene, but this tiny act, walking without fear, without weight, without letters hidden in a drawer. I took the bus without knowing exactly where I was headed. I got off near the sea. I hadn't gone in years, maybe because it hurt too much. Jack used to say the sea bored him, that he didn't get why people liked staring at the same horizon. But for me, the sea is the only thing that never lies. It's always there, moving, changing, starting over. I walked along the damp sand with my shoes in my hand, letting the cold water brush my feet. Each wave was like someone else's breath, steady, patient. I stared at the horizon and thought that, in a way, it was like reading a letter without a sender. Only movement, no name, no story. I took the notebook from my bag. It was no longer a book of memories, but of future. I began to write without thinking too much. Not about him, not about Julie, not about what happened. I wrote about the morning, the wind, the coffee I'd had, how the sea sounds different when you're at peace. I wrote about the freedom of not having to prove anything, the value of keeping quiet when everything has already been said. The words flowed on their own, soft, clean. It wasn't a confession, it was a breath. I stayed a long time, until the sun rose fully and the heat began to climb. I looked around, people running, couples taking pictures, dogs chasing each other aimlessly. No one knew who I was, what I'd done, what had happened. And that felt liberating. I was just another woman walking the beach, hair messy, a small smile, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to exist. As I walked back to the promenade, I remembered the last time I'd been there with Jack. He complained about the wind, the noise, the sand. I listened without saying anything, as so many times before. But now, remembering it, I felt no resentment. I simply understood that my whole life had been a long preparation for this instant, looking back without my voice shaking. Everything that hurt had done its job. It made me stronger, yes, but softer too. I learned strength isn't in holding on. It's in letting go without fearing what comes next. I sat on a bench and looked at the sea once more. I closed my eyes and listened to the waves. I thought of Julie, how perhaps at that very moment she too was trying to begin again from somewhere else, with other gestures. We didn't need to talk. Each had found her way to say goodbye. Mine was silence, hers, who knows, but it no longer mattered. What united us was a lie, what freed us was the truth. I took a deep breath and by pure instinct said softly, "That's enough." I don't know if I said it to him, the sea, or myself, but the phrase sounded like closure, a period. There was no redemption, no revenge, no poetic justice, only calm. I stood, put the notebook away, and started walking back. On my way home, I passed an antique store. In the window, there was a blue box, very much like the one that had held the letters. I looked at it a moment and smiled. I didn't buy it. I didn't need another. I no longer kept anything, not secrets, not memories, not promises. Everything that remained was inside me, and it didn't need locking in a box. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the buildings, I poured a glass of wine and lit a candle. The light trembled on the table, and it seemed the perfect gesture to close it all. Not a ceremony, an intimate, everyday, silent act. I looked at my reflection in the glass and saw a different woman, not younger, not stronger, but more whole. I thought about all I'd lived, what hurt, what I learned, and understood that, in the end, there's no greater justice than going on breathing with dignity. I leaned toward the flame and murmured, "He wrote me in another voice, but I'm the one signing this story." I pinched out the candlewick without fear and sat in the dark, listening only to the distant sound of the city and the steady heartbeat of my own life. And that's where my story ends. Or at least, this part. I don't know if it left you angry, relieved, or with that strange mixed truths leave when they no longer hurt. But if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Now I'm curious. What would you have done in my place? I'll love reading you in the comments. And if you like real stories told without adornment like life itself, subscribe and come with me to the next one. Because believe me, I still have a few truths left to tell.